Good morning and welcome to today's webcast, Management Succession and Ownership Transition for Business Sustainability. Before we begin, I'm going to play a brief housekeeping video.
Welcome, and thanks for joining us. We're pleased to present another in our ongoing series of continuing professional education webcasts to help companies and individuals conquer challenges as they plan for what's next. Our presentation will start in a few moments. Before we begin, here are a few things to keep in mind. You can customize how you both view our presentation and interact with the presenter. For better viewing, close all other applications and turn up your speaker volume. You can also adjust window size and placement or enter full screen mode using the controls at the top of the window or dragging the bottom right-hand corner to resize. At the bottom of your screen, you'll see a series of icons, each relating to a different aspect of our session. You can download the group attendance sheet and a PDF copy of today's slides from the slide deck and handouts widget to the right of the slide view. You can ask our presenter questions during the webcast by typing a question in the Q&A window below the slide view and clicking submit. We'll do our best to answer all questions during the presentation or follow up via email. If you experience technical difficulty during today's presentation, refresh your browser by hitting the F5 key. Today's session will offer you 1 CPE credit. To receive credit, you must meet the requirements as specified by the National Association of State Boards of Accountancy. You must attend at least 50 minutes of the session and respond to at least 75% of the polling questions, which we'll ask throughout today's presentation. To respond to a poll, click the button next to your answer. We'll track your progress and alert you when you've earned CPE credit. You can then click the certificate icon in the CPE Progress widget to open a PDF file that you can save to your computer. Don't worry if you can't download your PDF certificate today. We'll email a copy to you in 2 weeks. If you're attending this webcast in a group, you must complete our attendance sheet to receive CPE credit. The attendance sheet is available in the slide deck and handouts widget. Please have all group members sign it and send only 1 sheet per group. Also note that CPE credit can be awarded only to participants registered as themselves and isn't available to participants who view the on-demand version. As a reminder, the presentation you're about to see isn't legal, investment, or accounting advice. We encourage you to seek the counsel of a professional service provider to apply this content to your specific circumstances.
Thank you everyone for joining us today. I'm happy to introduce today's presenters, Mark Steranka and Jay Silverstein. Mark, I will now turn the line over to you to get us started.
Okay, thanks, Emily, and thanks everyone for joining us today. We've got a great turnout, and we appreciate you taking the time to spend an hour with us. I'm Mark Steranka. I'm a partner with Moss Adams, and I lead our business consulting group. I have the pleasure of working with businesses across many industries, and this is a very important and very timely topic. Management succession and ownership transition are impacting organizations across the U.S. really kind of at a record pace historically, and we see that firsthand just within our client base here at Moss Adams. And so we're really excited to talk to you about it. So our agenda, we're going to talk about the drivers or business factors impacting businesses relative to ownership transition and management succession. We're going to talk about the similarities and differences between ownership transition and management succession. Then we're going to dive into both aspects, including considerations, strategies, tools. So when we're talking about either ownership transition or management succession, what do we really mean? What does it mean to you? How do you tackle it? How do you turn it from a challenge into an opportunity for your organization and your organizations? And then of course we'll take questions, and I encourage you to submit questions, and we'll take those at the end. So first, let's talk about business factors. And really there are 3 primary factors that we'd like to talk about. There are others, but all 3 of these have the commonality of they impact people. And ownership transition and management succession both are about people. Neither can happen without people. And so what's happening in the marketplace and what's impacting all of us, including us here at Moss Adams? So we've got the baby boomer effect, so the population demographics and what they're doing to the marketplace. And we're going to delve into each of these areas in a little bit more detail. Hiring needs. We've got a robust economy that's driving hiring needs. It's great. It's great for all of us. It's a good challenge. And we've got employee engagement deficiencies across the landscape, which is a little bit more alarming challenge for us all, but also an opportunity. So let's look at each in a little bit more detail. So population demographics. Again, we're going to focus in here kind of on the baby boomers as the drivers, but you can see we've got, on the order of 74 million baby boomers leaving the marketplace, right? They're retiring. They're either at or approaching retirement age, and every year we have a lot of baby boomers leaving the marketplace to retire. So what is that doing? That's driving the need for ownership transition to the extent that those baby boomers are owners, and it's driving the need for management succession to the degree that those baby boomers are hold management roles within the organizations that they reside. And so then what does that then cascade in terms of impact on all of our organizations? So one challenge besides those individuals leaving the marketplace are supply and demand issues. So if we look at the baby boomers compared to Generation X, we've got 74 million baby boomers going out, 66 million Gen X behind them. So we've got a supply and demand issue. So that makes ownership transition and management succession more challenging because we have a smaller pool to draw from. Obviously, it has other impacts in terms of really kind of creating an employee's marketplace. But it in essence makes transition and succession a bigger challenge than it might be because we have less to draw from. We also have the challenge of, if we compare the baby boomers to Generation Y or the baby boomers' kids, is you have an age gap. And especially if you're in a family-owned business, you often encounter baby boomer owners going out, may want to hand off the baton to son or daughter, i.e. the next generation, and are they ready? And what do we need to do if they're not ready to get them ready? And that so also drives issues on and challenges relative to both ownership transition, if ownership is part of that, and in a family-owned business it typically is, and then also, of course, in terms of management succession, because now are we ready to hand off the baton, and if not, what do we need to do? So we've got a shortage of owners, we've got a shortage of leaders for management succession, we have increasing costs due to a supply and demand, and increasing competition for those resources because of supply and demand. So it complicates what's already a fairly challenging endeavor to address, which is both relative to ownership transition and management succession. So hiring needs. So what's the economy doing to us? Well, Moss Adams happens to be headquartered in the Western U.S. We happen to serve the Western U.S. We work nationally and internationally. But if we look at our home turf, we see that 7 out of the 10 top hiring states in the U.S. are all in the West. The reason we just focus on that is that's great for the West, good economy, driving job growth, all good. But again, an employee's market, it's making it tougher to attract or recruit the talent that we all want. It's making it tougher to keep or retain the talent we want, and it's putting even more of a strain on efforts to deal with management succession. And then finally, employee engagement. So this is really kind of, I'd say, an epidemic across the U.S., and actually it's worse if we take a global perspective. But the bottom line here is basically from Gallup polls done over the last 15 plus years, 17 plus years, that we understand that employee engagement has hovered around 32, 33%, let's call it a third. And so what does that tell us? That tells us that 2/3 of our employee base are not fully invested in what they're doing. That kind of breaks down to about 50% of that 66, 67% is quote unquote not engaged, meaning I'm going through the motions, I'm punching the clock, I'm doing what I'm being asked to do, but kind of nothing more. and you've got about 18% who are actively disengaged, meaning I'm working against my employer, I'm working against the company, I'm not happy here, and I'm doing less than just going through the motions. I may be a negative influence. So ultimately, what is that? The impact is lost productivity. We're not firing on all cylinders. If we have a third of our employees are truly invested or engaged in what they're doing, then we get a big group who's not. And so then that makes succession a bigger challenge, because where are the candidates? And now not only are we developing people to, ascend through the organization and take on bigger roles, we're more rudimentary to that. We're focusing on just getting them to be fully productive employees. And so again, that complicates the situation and the challenge that we all face. So first polling question, focusing on business factors. What is the primary business driver of both ownership transition and management succession? We talked about three. We talked about population demographics. We talked about the economy and hiring needs. We talked about employee engagement. So which one feels like the primary driver? So select the option that you want, and then please hit the submit button, and that's what will actually acknowledge your selection. You might have to scroll down on your screen depending on the size of your viewing window to see the submit button that's at the bottom. So I'll give you a few more seconds to make your selection, and let's take a look at the results. So about 45% population demographics, about 19% economy, about 36% employee engagement. While, of course, they're all factors because we included them and presented them all as factors, but really the one that is the highest score, population demographics, that pervades everything relative to both ownership transition and management succession. But they're all important and they're all affecting what we do. So let's talk about transition and succession. And the reason we're going to spend just a couple minutes talking about one versus the other is that sometimes ownership transition and management succession are synonymous, but they are distinctly different things, and these terms are often interchanged and confused. So we want to just clarify, when we're talking about ownership transition and we're talking about management succession, what do we actually mean? So ownership transition is literally the ownership of the organization. Think of it as controlling ownership. I mean, of course, you can have minority ownership, but really, who's making sure that this organization is a going concern? There's the banking or financial elements associated with that. There's the legal structure associated with that. But without ownership, at least in terms of businesses, they're not going to be a going concern if there isn't someone owning them. And so that's a requirement by definition. Management succession is who's running the business from top to bottom, not just the C-suite, not just the owners if they're a part of the executive group, but who's running the business on a day-to-day basis at all levels of the organization, not just at the top. And yes, ownership transition, owners and management can be one and the same, but they don't have to be. And we need to deal with them distinctly, and where they are synonymous, deal with them in that way too. But they are two different things, both of which are necessary. The final point here is that management succession impacts every organization. So we work with businesses, private businesses, public companies, but for-profit businesses, of course, we work with not-for-profit organizations, and we work with governments. Not-for-profits and governments all have the same succession needs as private businesses. They just don't happen to necessarily have the ownership transition needs. But succession, management succession affects every organization. So what are some of the similarities? As I mentioned, owners and management can be the same. Often in smaller organizations, they're the C-suite or a subset of the C-suite. When we're talking about developing people from a management succession standpoint, part of that development certainly can be focused on developing future owners. and especially for future internal transitions of an organization, i.e. internal sales, development of owners should be part of that process of the management succession. I was talking about businesses require continuity. In an ideal world, continuity is a good thing in both ownership and management. Again, they don't have to be the same people, but you want continuity for sustained success. And so both are important. And then, of course, we can have examples where they are literally synonymous when we have employee stock ownership plans or ESOPs, where we're making every employee a part of the ownership group. And so then they are literally one and the same. So what are some of the differences? So one is ownership transition, and in fact, the same comment can be made for management succession, often tends to be applied to just the people at the top of the organization. So again, let's assume the members of the C-suite are owners. We tend to think of management succession and ownership transition as just the people at the top. Well, the ownership part might be just the people at the top, but management succession isn't. That should focus on all levels of the organization, because we have managerial, or just think of it as a leadership. We need to have leadership at every level of the organization. It's not just at the top. Owners don't have to be active in the business. You can have passive owners, i.e. silent partners. They're just involved with financing. They're not involved with strategy. You don't see them on a day-to-day basis. You might not even know who they are necessarily. And when we get into a family business scenario, owners who are involved in the business don't even have to be in the C-suite or even management. Sometimes you'll have owners, oftentimes it's the kids, the siblings, just have non-managerial. They might have technical roles in the organization. So you can have owners not involved, and you can have owners who are involved who aren't in leadership roles, all of which are dynamics but differences between ownership transition and management succession. So the last topic here, just on the comparison of ownership transition and management succession, and this kind of just pulls together why they're both important, but also why they're different. You can, when you're going through ownership transition, or you're going through significant management succession, which tends to, and especially where that tends to be where owners are leaders in the organization, so you're having to deal with both ownership transition and management succession at the top of the organization. How you handle that can mean the world to sort of the sustainability, or at least the near-term success of the organization. So how you deal with it and how you communicate it obviously can impact your customers, can impact your employees, it can impact the value of the organization. Often, with ownership, we're talking about legacy, it can impact that, and so dealing with this can have a material impact on the longevity and sustainability of the organization. So, second polling question: which of the following is a false statement relative to ownership transition and management succession? Owners and management may be the same. Cultivation of management translates into development of future owners. Ownership transition and management succession should both focus primarily on the individuals at the top of the organization. And sustained success requires continuity of ownership and management. So which is a false statement? So again, scroll down if you need to after you make your selection, to hit the submit button. And I'll give you a few more seconds this time to ponder those prompts and make your selection. Okay, let's see what we have here. Very good. So we've got owners, basically 71% said ownership transition and management succession should both focus primarily on individuals at the top of the organization. They often do, and they often shouldn't. We want to, ownership does tend more often than not to reside at the top of the organization, but management succession should not. That should be vertically throughout the whole organization. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Jay to talk about ownership transition. Take it away, Jay.
Thanks, Mark. I'm, just by brief introduction, Jay Silverstein. I'm a partner at Moss Adams, and like Mark, I work across industry groups. My primary role is to help our clients develop and then implement their ownership transition strategy. I'm going to spend the next 20 minutes kind of talking about ownership transition and hopefully give you some kind of a framework and how you could apply that to your own organization. So I'd like to start by showing this somewhat full chart of the business and personal life cycle. And while not every business's and not every person's path follows this path, I think it gives us a good view of sort of kind of what happens in our life personally and what happens in the business world of kind of getting out there, starting up our business, kind of business then grows and develops. We go through a bunch of growing pains, both personally and business-wise, and then hopefully as our business matures and we mature, the business starts humming along, and then we get to that place later in life where either we can no longer work full-time or decide that we don't want to work full-time, or there's been some downturn in the business, and that's where that cycle sort of starts all over again. And oftentimes kind of in that thunder stage, or hopefully towards the end of that stage, is where the actual ownership transition occurs. Owners are in their 50s, 60s, 70s. They decide that it's time for them to get out. The point I wanted to make about all of this is if that is when we first start thinking about ownership transition, we're really left up to sort of chance and luck, because ownership transition is not just the event of transitioning that ownership to somebody else. There's a lot of things, one of which Mark has brought up with regard to management succession, that can have an impact on that ownership transition plan, whether or not it'll meet the owner's goals and objectives. So like I said, it's really a process. We want to hopefully start that process well in advance of a ownership transition or a transaction. And the ownership transition can take, many forms, and I'm going to kind of walk through later on several different sort of ownership transition or exit strategy alternatives, from an outright sale of the business to a third party to an internal transition to family members. But if we wait until the end, we oftentimes aren't ready to do this. Most owners aren't serial acquirers of businesses. They don't buy and sell businesses all the time, although there are some individuals out there that do that. But most of the clients that I work with, when they are exiting the business and transitioning their ownership either externally or internally, it's a one-time event. One of the things that I've noticed is that oftentimes people aren't emotionally ready to do that, particularly in the closely held business world, where you spent all your life growing and developing and putting your heart and soul into the business. Most people haven't thought about what am I going to do outside of the business now that I'm no longer working in the business. And the other important factor is many of them aren't ready financially. And so I saw a statistic the other day regarding closely held businesses that something like 90% of an individual's wealth is tied up in their business. And so that makes the decisions around what exit strategies will work for that owner significantly different than if they had financially planned, maybe taken some money out of the business or saved the money that isn't tied up in the business. And I know that's often difficult given the needs of the business, but if somebody is somewhat financially secure outside of the business, then what they can do with regard to an exit strategy or an ownership transition plan gives them more options. They don't need to sell for the highest price to some sort of strategic buyer, if that's what, or financial buyer, because they have enough wealth to look at perhaps transitioning the business to their kids or selling it to key employees at maybe not the same price that they would need or that they would get from a sale to a strategic buyer. The other thing that I've noticed is that most individuals that have their wealth tied up in their family business or their closely held business don't understand investments outside of a closely held business, and their relationship to marketable securities sometimes becomes a little bit difficult in that they understand their business, they feel like they've got some control over the risk, but when you liquidate your investment through a sale and all of a sudden you have a pile of cash that you now have to invest in a stock market that you don't quite understand, or the return on investment, that becomes an issue. So having some sort of understanding or a better understanding or education of how your capital, which has all been tied up in your business, is now going to be deployed somewhere else is often helpful. The last thing I would say about this process is I don't think that I've met a business owner that isn't proud to talk about their business, isn't concerned about their business or their family for that matter. And it isn't because this isn't important to them. Often what I see is, and it's not that they have their head buried in the sand, really, it's that they have their head buried in their business. And it's not because it isn't important, it's because other things are more urgent. Mortality becomes an issue. Nobody likes to think about their own mortality. And so we often find that people are interested in, yeah, I need to do something about this, but I don't have to do something about this today, and I'd rather not think about this. And yeah, it makes sense to go through a process to get there, but when I leave your office, I'm going to have 30 emails to address regarding pressing issues, so this becomes a back burner issue. So if you can get past those barriers, kind of what does the planning process look like? And I wanted to try and kind of lay it out in a way that hopefully takes some of the mystery out of it. And while there are a lot of issues that are involved in it, the process is pretty straightforward. It starts with who are you going to engage in the process of figuring out what your ownership transition plan would be. I've listed attorneys, CPAs, business advisors, family, other owners, potential future owners. The real issue is I think it starts with the business owner and those around him that business owner trusts. So it could be your CPA, it could be a business advisor, it could be your insurance agent, your attorney, but for me it's whoever you have that relationship with that you trust their judgment and you trust their ability to help you through that process. You know, as the process rolls forward, I think it's important to bring in those that are going to be affected by it. If it's a family transition, bringing in adult children at some point in time so that they understand what it is you want to do is important. Bringing in those, if it's some sort of internal management buyout, engaging them in the process makes sense as well. And then once you've determined who you're going to bring into that process, it's really a question of the determination and prioritization of your goals and objectives. And these vary per individual, but it's goals and objectives not only in what do I want to have happen to my business, but personally, what do I want? How much money will I need when I'm no longer able to live off the cash flow of the business, need or want? What do I want for my family, whether that's my spouse or my children? What's important to me in terms of the legacy of my business? How much do I care about what's going to happen to the business when I'm no longer there? And these are all sort of very personal matters that each individual business owner needs to decide for themselves what's important to them, from everything to I'm really concerned about, my major concern is that this business continues on into the future and that my employees and my family are taken care of, to I've worked very hard to grow this business, and what I want out of the end of it is financial security. And yes, I'd like my employees to be taken care of, but that isn't my top concern, and so I might be going down a different path. Once we kind of understand what those goals and objectives are, we need to sort of prioritize them, because some of them are at cross purposes. I'd like to retire tomorrow and spend X amount of dollars per year, but that just isn't possible given my current situation. So we really need to understand what these goals and objectives and prioritize to them what's the most important. And then the process then becomes figuring out where am I at with regard to that. What's the financial health of my business? What could my business either generate in terms of cash flow to fund an internal buyout, or what does the current status of my business do for purposes of valuation? Where is my management team at? This is where the sort of management succession and ownership transition comes together. If I were to walk away from this business or get hit by the bus, how would that affect the value of this business going forward? Do I have my estate plan in order? Am I set up in such a way that I'm going to minimize estate tax and also income tax on the transition of this business? And finally, what's my personal financial situation? What do I need out of the transition of this business, either in terms of future cash flow or a lump sum that'll help me meet my personal and family goals? And then kind of once we've figured out where you are, the next step is to figure out, okay, based on where you're at, what alternatives are available to me in terms of an ownership transition plan down the future? What things might I need to do in terms of business performance, management succession, or the development of the management team, or saving for retirement, or those types of things? What do I need to do to get there? And then putting forth a plan of how you're going to get there when that exit strategy is going to occur, hopefully 5 to 10 years down the road. And then continuing to go back and review that plan. I don't know how many times I've worked with family businesses where they're going to transition to the next generation, where at some point in the future, the children either decide they don't want to participate in the business, or the parents decide that they're not capable of managing the business. Do we need to do some type of course correction? And through this planning process, what we're really trying to do is build transferable value. That goes back to the idea of what is my business worth if I'm no longer attached to it? Have I created a sustainable business? Is there successor management that could take over this business even if I was not there? And Mark will talk to that management succession piece of this. Have I created sufficient liquidity and net worth to fund my lifestyle? Have I anticipated and planned for my estate tax burden? With the change in the tax law or potential change in the tax law, that may become less of an issue, but it's still an issue in determining how much of my wealth will I be able to transition to my children based on the current status of the estate tax law. And finally, have I built an organization that can continue in some type of orderly transition? On the internal transition side, have I structured an organization where my family members know what their roles are, understand ownership versus management? Have I created an organization that's going to continue to succeed without me? Because when you really look at sort of the ownership transition options, they all are dependent upon the future performance of the business. So once we've kind of identified kind of what your objectives are, we can then look at what the appropriate exit strategy alternative is. Those exit strategies go from everything to a total sale to a third party that's either a competitor, a strategic buyer, or a financial buyer where you've decided, my decision is I want to get out, I want to sell the entire company, and I'm going to find somebody to buy the business, and then you go down that path to what we frequently see is some type of sale to what I would call an insider, and that could be family, it could be management, it could also be an ESOP, and I kind of put those in two different buckets. One is I am going to sell the company to some third party. The other is I'm going to sell the company to key employees, management, my family members, perhaps even an ESOP. And the third alternative is really I'm not going to sell, I'm going to continue to own and grow, and perhaps what I'm going to do is not transition the ownership at this point in time, but I'm going to create a successor management team that when I'm no longer around, the business will continue to operate and my family will benefit from ownership of this company for which I have installed some type of professional management team. But across the board, all of these alternatives depend upon the future cash flow of the business. So if I'm selling to a strategic or a financial buyer, they're looking at how well this business is going to perform for them and what kind of return the investment that they're paying you, which is the purchase price to buy you out. If it's some type of a management or family transition, generally family members, children, or key management people don't have the capital to pay the current owners out all in one lump sum, and so you're going to get paid over time. And generally, you're going to get paid less than what you would get if you sold to a strategic buyer. And so can I, number one, accept a lower price, and two, can I accept both the risk and that cash flow over time? So those are things that we look at because generally management doesn't have the wherewithal to pay, and as the owner, I'm going to have to finance that buyout. And that's, again, where this intersection comes in is have I developed that management team in such a way that I'm confident that they're going to be able to continue to perform, this business is going to be able to continue to perform to pay me that cash flow over time. Same with family members, and it becomes even more difficult in a family transition because you sort of got the family issues and the business issues. If I'm selling to key management that aren't family members, I'm looking at them through one lens. If I'm looking at my family members as being that key management going forward, things get a little more confusing in terms of my ability to accurately assess their ability. So like I said, once we've sort of prioritized the goals and objectives, we then need to look at which of these alternatives would be available to you. And I think sometimes this gets a little confusing in different industry groups because there isn't a one-size-fits-all. It has to be an alternative that's consistent with my goals and objectives and consistent with my business, the health of my business, and my own personal financial health. And I think the third part is also consistent with my industry group, and not only my industry that I'm in, but where I fit in that industry. Because not every business in an industry has the same attractiveness to a strategic buyer or a competitor or a financial buyer. I do some work in the wine industry, and depending upon where you fit in that space, there are different buyers looking for different opportunities. So just because I'm in the wine, I'm a winery owner, it doesn't mean private equity is going to come buy my winery. So I need to know where I sort of fit in that industry group so I understand who the potential acquirers are there. And then finally, taking a look at that, I'd say, if there's no alternatives that are satisfactory to me, what can I do to change that? If it's my management team isn't quite there, then how do I develop that management team? If it's that I haven't saved enough money and the buyout at X million dollars isn't going to get me where I need to go, do I need to either work longer, or how do I drive more value in my business so I can meet those goals and objectives? If my family members aren't, ready to enter the business, how do I determine or how do I help them get there? To finish up, I just kind of wanted to go through sort of some common exit strategies that we deal with, and some of the tools that we use are things that are available to help a business owner go through that ownership transition. So if I'm selling to a third party, I'm going to go through both of these, both on the personal side of what we can do for the owner, but also some business issues that can help out as well. So on the personal side, if I've decided to sell to a third party, are there things I can do from an estate planning perspective prior to a transaction to minimize estate taxes? And do I understand what my financial plan and my cash flow needs are? And do I completely understand that what I'm going to get out of this business is going to be enough for me or more than enough to take care of my future cash flow needs? On the business side, if we decide to sell to a third party but we don't think the value's there, what can we do to help on the business improvement side to drive more value? Also, kind of what can we do to sort of dress the business up for sale, do some diligence prior to a transaction to deal with what I would call any skeletons in the closet, interview or hire an investment banker to help you get that price that you're looking for. And then on the tax side of things, what we do for a lot of business owners is we'll do some preliminary calculations to determine what a deal means to you. If I'm selling my business for $20 million, what's that mean? Is that net of debt, net of expenses, net of taxes? So oftentimes understanding what that purchase price means in actual dollars in your pockets is critically important. Then how can we structure the deal to minimize taxes? On the management buyout side, again, we have the same sort of personal issues. Am I going to get enough money out of that buyout to meet my goals and objectives, and do I have my estate plan set up in such a way that I'm going to minimize taxes? And on the business side, again, there's sort of two areas on a management buyout is the identity and development of the successors. Do those individuals who are part of management capable, and what can we do to develop their skills so we feel comfortable selling to them? And then with a management buyout, how do we structure that? What's the most appropriate structure from a tax and cash flow perspective? And we can help sort of model that out so that the management understands the cost to them and that the current owner or departing owner understands the net cash flow they're going to receive out of a transaction. An ESOP is sort of a specialized management buyout. It really isn't a management buyout. It is all the employees essentially buying you out. It has some very lucrative tax advantages to a seller, and so sellers often look at this as a way to sort of bridge that gap, that I'm going to minimize my taxes, which will give me more after-tax cash flow. But ESOPs work in certain situations and they don't work in others. There are companies out there that will do feasibility analysis, which is to really understand, will this ESOP work financially? And the other part is just getting a general education of what it means, what an ESOP means to management, what it means to the rank and file employees, what it means to the company going forward, and what it means to you as a departing owner. On the family transition side, again, we deal with the estate and financial planning piece of it. On the business side, it's all about fairness and ability. It's particularly if the business is the major asset, how do we treat all our children equitably if some are involved in the business and some aren't? And the other side is to provide an independent, objective look at the ability of the next generation to manage the company And sometimes it's hard in a family situation to really objectively view the performance of your children. And the last thing I would say is on the final option, which is I'm not going to sell. I'm going to continue to grow this business and put in a management team that's capable of running it when I'm no longer involved. And that deals with management succession. It deals with compensation for that management team to keep them around. It deals with entity structuring. How am I going to structure this entity in such a way that I'm going to benefit from it, that future generations of my family are going to benefit, and then that ties into the whole estate planning side of the transaction as well. So we come to the polling question for this part of the presentation: which type of ownership transition is most common? I'm interested in kind of what your experience is, either in your industry or your friends or other businesses that you're aware of what you're seeing now in terms of internal versus external transitions. And the internal would involve management, or I would say family members. External is sort of a sale to a third party. Make your choice, hit submit, and then we will go to the results. So it's about 50-50. That doesn't surprise me. When I'd say 15 years ago when I joined Moss Adams, it was sort of heavily weighted to the internal transition. I think my own experience is that we're seeing more external transitions. Part of it might have to do with the quality of or quantity of the internal management succession. I think the other thing that happened is the recession back in 2008 changed a fair number of my clients' minds about continuing to retain ownership of a business and how hard it is, particularly in the family situation, to structure that in a way that works for future generations. So with that, I will turn it back over to Mark to talk about management succession.
Excellent. Thank you, Jay. It was really insightful, and hopefully the audience is getting a sense of Jay has a very calm demeanor, and when we're dealing with ownership transition and management succession when it's related, having a good, grounded, stabilizing influence in the process is really helpful. So hopefully that came across. It certainly did for me. So management succession. So this is about creating value, sustaining value, growing future leaders, and hopefully future owners, again, depending on the ownership transition strategy. So first, we're going to talk a little bit about succession considerations, and really this is about understanding your organization. So first you got to start with, so what is the breadth and depth of our organization, meaning what's the structure, what's the span of control, what are the number of different types of functions or departments, so what does that look like, and what are the responsibilities of people leading each function or element within the organization. So what's the coverage that we need in terms of management? Again, thinking of multiple layers, not just at the top. What's the resource pool that we have to draw from? Sometimes, especially in smaller, in some cases mid-sized companies, we'll find organizational gaps. There's a big gap between layers in the organization. For example, it could be a big gap from sort of C-suite to the next level. It might, instead of senior management, you might go from C-suite to middle management. I'm just using those terms as just sort of to characterize, but you might feel like we've got some gaps in terms of the capabilities, and so to go to the next level, we're gonna work on up-leveling them more. We got to think about the competencies that exist today, and we need to think about, okay, how well are we defining competencies? Are we communicating what those are? How are we developing competencies? And so what do we mean by those? Think of them to some extent kind of your core values, but for individuals, leadership, management, communication, business acumen, technical acumen, sales, operational functionality and capabilities, all sorts of things. But are we defining those? Are we developing those, specifically? And really what we're talking about, what's required for success in each progressive level. What you don't want is the classic, hey, you were, an employee today or staff, and you're a manager tomorrow. Good luck with managing this group, and you've never managed before, you've never been trained or developed on management. So this is about preparation, understanding what's required to be successful, and giving the tools to our employees to be able to be successful. We need to understand the demographics in our businesses. What is the age distribution? How many people are within 5 years of being 65 per se? For those that are, what are their intentions in terms of working? And those are healthy conversations. It's not, hey, when are you going to retire? I need to know. It's, what are you thinking about? It's because we have to understand what are the moving parts in our organizations, and we shouldn't shy away from understanding those, because we need to understand those. And then retention. What is our turnover rate? Do we have pockets, which is often the case? We have particular challenges in retention in certain areas or certain functions. It might be because of challenges within the organization. It might be external market challenges, i.e. competition. But so what is our turnover landscape across our organization? So those are all considerations for thinking about succession. And then strategies. So we need to start with, what are the owner's expectations? A, what's their involvement and what's their future involvement look like? B, what do they want others' involvement to be and look like in terms of leadership, and making sure that we understand that. And all of that ties back and certainly to the elements that Jay was talking about in terms of, personal financial planning, estates, all of that. That all has to be intertwined, but we got to start with ownership and understand, they looking to be out one day, or they looking to phase out over X period of time, what would that phasing look like, etc. We need to address the needs of the organization. So when we're thinking about management succession and leadership, we should be thinking about, what's our strategic plan? What are we trying to accomplish? And therefore, what do we need to be driving the things that we need to be doing to achieve our goals that are within our plan? We need to create options, right? Don't then put all your eggs in one basket. How can we develop capability, leadership capability, vertically and horizontally across the organization, and yes, not be counting on one person? Because, right, management succession is about not only planning for expected changes in the organization, whether they're retirements, promotions, et cetera, but also the unexpected. Someone wins lottery, someone has a health issue, someone dies. How do we create backfill capacity, and again, not be relying on any one person for any one situation? Take the long view. What we mean by that is, let's go back to the family business scenario. Sometimes the next generation is not ready, and sometimes we might even have to go outside of the organization, or in this case, outside of the family, to be able to get the business acumen that we need to bridge a gap of capability in terms of timing. We need to provide more time for development of the next generation before we make a handoff. And then communicating intent. There's nothing worse than uncertainty, because as human beings, we assume the worst. And so, especially when ownership transition and management succession intersect at the top of the organization, i.e. our CEO, our CFO, our COO have been the owners, have been the leaders, and so we're not only losing owners in retirement, we're losing leaders, we're going to worry. So having a plan and communicating that plan is ultimately important, and that is a day-to-day challenge now because of the baby boomers. It's a good challenge, but it's a challenge. So succession tools, I'm going to touch on quickly a series of slides that look at career pathing, competency development, performance-based compensation, knowledge transfer. And just, again, think of these as tools. What are things that we need to be thinking about and focusing on relative to management succession? So the first, career planning, career pathing, and career planning associated with career paths. But just some thoughts here. A, what does it look like? Just mapping that out. We all think it's obvious often, but it's not to everyone. What does that look like? So what's a progression look like? But importantly in there is the concept of are we in what we use the term upper out organization? Is it all about ascending in management, or how do we take care of the folks who aren't going to be managers? They're going to be technical experts. So we need to have managerial paths, and we have to have technical paths of growth, because we need to retain both types of people over time, but often that technical career path gets sort of pushed to the wayside because people don't think it's all about management. Well, management's important, but it's only, you can't do the managerial part if you don't have the technical part. So what does that look like? How do I, especially for millennials, we haven't even talked about that group yet, but they want to see what the future can look like. They want to see how they can have an impact, so we got to help them visualize that. From a competency development standpoint, then, is at each tier in the organization, what competencies need to be in place to be successful. And whether that's development of self, team building development of others, business acumen, technical acumen, communication skills, what does it look like? And when I'm at this level, what is the expectation? When I'm successful, I'm being able to demonstrate X. If I'm at the next level, I'm able to demonstrate Y. And then what that helps guide is, what does the company do to develop that competency? And then what do I need to do to develop my own competencies? But I see what the target is. I see what the expectation is. And the next slide is just and I know you can't read it, and it's intentional that you can't read it, so sorry about that, but it's just a matrix showing we've got acumen on the left side, and we've got level of the organization going across the top. And it's just to reinforce a point of, just define what is competency of developing self, developing others, project management, problem solving, sales, client service. What does that look like at each level? What is the expectation? So there's no mystery there. We know what to develop towards. And then a couple slides on compensation. Compensation is not the most important thing in terms of retaining people, developing people, but it is important, I would say, for retaining people in the long term, or it can work against you. It's not people. Well, I should have said it differently. People don't typically leave organizations because of pay, but you can use pay as a way to keep people. It's not going to be the overriding driver, but it can be an important driver, especially for trying to keep key people. And so two concepts here. One is, in this slide is just thinking about performance-based compensation. And the biggest takeaway I want you to have here is aligning incentive compensation, let's say bonus, to where the employees have impact, what they can control. So what we're showing here is 3 components of performance-based compensation: company performance, department performance, and individual performance, and how you might vary. So having a holistic view, we want employees to be thinking about not just themselves and not just the team and not just the company, but all 3. But also we want to weight, if we're doing that, where they have the most impact. So this is just demonstrating, you might have, for executives, the biggest portion of their incentive pay would be company performance. For management, it'd be departmental or team or function performance. Staff, it would be for their individual performance. What they can control, make the biggest portion, because that aligns with what they can do. The other element of this, and so cash, sort of by definition, is a short-term tool. It doesn't keep people along for the long term, but you can translate cash into something that's longer term if you use the concept of deferred compensation. And so that is taking a portion of cash and deferring it for the long term. Often it's based on tenure, based on age, and setting up a deferred compensation program, but basically creating a quote-unquote golden handcuffs for someone that we're going to be contributing as a company towards their pay based on performance, but long-term pay. They got to be around and stick around to be able to qualify for it. So we're giving them a reason to stick around a long-term from a fiscal or financial or cash perspective. And lastly, knowledge transfer. So this is probably the most common thing that comes up with management succession, which is, I see a lot of knowledge going out the door, institutional knowledge. What do I do about that? And so these would seem obvious things, but coaching, right? So how are we extracting that knowledge from a coaching, supervisor, supervisee standpoint? But really then getting beyond that to mentoring. For example, how do we pair more experienced, we'll say older people who are going to be retiring, have lots of institutional knowledge, with younger people? Talk about a great opportunity to pair, a baby boomer with a millennial, and over a period of time being able to mentor and teach them what I've learned. Cross-training, creating teams across organizations to cross-pollinate that knowledge and share that knowledge, identifying high-performing people programs where we identify those who we want to develop, for example, as future leaders, future owners, and building into that development process. What does it mean to be an owner? Take the mystery out of it. I was going to say I'm going to end there. We're going to go quickly to a last polling question before we run out of time. Which of the following are typical management succession tools? Career pathing, competency development, performance-based compensation, knowledge transfer, all of the above. Make your selection, submit, hit the submit button, scroll down to the submit button, and we'll give you a second here to make your choices. Thank you for your patience sticking around. I know it's 11:01. Let's see what we got. We've got a very attentive audience with 96.6% saying all of the above. So thank you. We do know that you've submitted questions. We appreciate you that you've submitted questions. We will get back to you on those. I will turn it over, though, back to Emily to wrap us up. Thank you so much. Back to you, Emily.
Awesome. Thank you, Mark, and thank you, Jay, for a great presentation. We did have quite a few questions come in, and we'll be following up with you after the webcast. Thank you for your questions. And as a reminder, if you attended today's presentation in a group and would like to receive CPE credit, you must complete the group attendance sheet found in the slide deck and handouts icon to the right of the slide view. If you participated as an individual and met all certification requirements, your certificate is available to download now in the CPE progress window, also to the right of the slide view. I'll keep the webcast console open for a few minutes to give you time to download your CPE certificate. A copy of your CPE certificate will be emailed within 2 weeks should you have any difficulty downloading it now. Here is a link to an online survey where you can provide feedback for today's presentation. Please take a moment to complete this survey as your feedback is very important to us. Thank you for joining us today, and we hope you'll join us again next time.